in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast. Fat max is the place where you're oxidizing the greatest amount of fat, but you're still oxidizing a hell of a lot of carbohydrate at fat max. Everyone, welcome back to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today we're joined by continuing guest host, Aaron Geiser, where we're going to focus and discuss all things substrate utilization. Aaron, welcome back to the show.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
Oh man, so Aaron and I offline started discussing substrate utilization. I was like, okay, Aaron, this is what we're going to talk about. And then he was like, well, there's this meta-analysis. I was like, whoa, we gotta record this. So I think actually, Aaron, if you want to share what that meta-analysis was talking about, and then we can kind of just go from there. I think it's really important because substrate utilization and what you're putting into your body is going to really affect your performance. So yeah, I'll let you take it from here, and then we can just go from there.
And this was a collection of data from a couple of years ago, but it was sent out to individuals that DNF'd a Ironman race. And, you know, a lot of the times we assume that most of these reasons are individuals are not prepared for the distance, or maybe the heat on the day had an outcome. But what this showed was over 90% of the individuals that responded to this particular questionnaire DNF'd because of gastrointestinal distress or GI issues. And it's interesting because often it's not something like people don't put that value on the day often. And it's such an important piece. And I'm glad we're here to discuss it a little bit more in depth today.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that meta-analysis showed that people, had GI distress, and most likely that's probably due to over-consuming, carbohydrates. Correct. In a sense. And it's something, I'm sure, in all the forums out there, and I've pushed it myself. I say, research shows that you're going to have the best endurance potential and reduce the stress of the endurance, the workout or the race or whatever it is, if you're consuming really as many carbohydrates as you can. And now it's like 90 to 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour has been shown to be kind of that upper limit of what you can absorb. However, there's a massive caveat and massive asterisk there. That's if you can absorb the carbohydrate, right? Because if you can't, when you take in carbohydrate, it goes into your stomach, into your lower intestine or upper intestine, it goes into your small intestine. Goodness gracious, if I forget anatomy or something like that, my Lord, it goes into your small intestine where it's going to then be absorbed. If it is not fully absorbed, it makes its way to your large intestine, where there is a lot of bacteria. There's a lot of bacteria that feed on carbohydrate, and specifically the simple sugars like glucose. And if you get a lot of carbohydrate into your large intestine, you're going to have an upset stomach. You're going to potentially have diarrhea. You're going to be running to the porta potty, not to the finish line. So it's really important that if you are somebody who to practice your fueling strategy before race day. Because this is kind of what I did during my Ironman, is I was just like, I'm just going to try to eat as much as I possibly can on the course that day. And sure enough, I was like getting cramping. I was like, my stomach didn't feel too good. And this was like, during like the 13-mile mark on the marathon. And it's like when you have a half marathon left and you can only run from like one cone to the next, it makes it really, really tough, to keep going. So we're here to say, pump the brakes, maybe practice that sort of stuff, and, really focus on like, let's get a better understanding of what, substrate, oxidation and utilization actually is, and then give some practical recommendations, I think, where we can really help some people, potentially be better in their performance.
And you kind of did speak of the current numbers that are being thrown around right now of 90 and 120 grams, and I think the biggest, I, I guess the biggest question mark to that is we really still don't know. It's not something that has really well been defined, and the way that we are able to test it in a lot of ways, we're not able to really get down to that finite number and say, okay, well, this person is 90, this
Mm-hmm.
person is 75, this person's 150. And I think that there is a lot of topics out there of individuals really trying to push that number even past the 120. And really a lot of, especially working with Dan, some of the things that we kind of find out in this case is that all they're showing is that their body can be resilient to take that amount of
Mm-hmm.
carbohydrate. We still don't necessarily know what percentage or how much of that total carbohydrate consumption is actually truly being absorbed, and whether it just be the testing has not gotten to that point, or just the overall abrasiveness of what we would have to go through to get that testing done
Mm-hmm.
in the middle of exercise, I
Yeah.
think just does leave a little bit of cloudiness to the edges of this topic, and it is a little bit more of a guesswork in general terminology here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly not cut and dry like most physiology, like people ask me all the time on Instagram, "Oh, what's best for this adaptation?" Or, like, should I only be doing this for this adaptation? Or I get in arguments with people who tell me that the only way to increase your capillary density and your mitochondrial volume density is to do zone 2 training. And I'm like, "No, I literally did my PhD research on this sort of stuff, and you're going to get adaptations across the entire spectrum, but it's not just black and white. It's not an on switch and an off switch. It's not, oh, this person, can absorb 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour, therefore their performance is going to be better, right? It's and this is where I encourage people to experiment on yourself, right? Like, if you mess up one training day because you accidentally intake too many carbohydrates and you have stomach issues or something like that, that's not the end of the world. But if you get to race day and you've changed your nutrition plan, or you're racing and it's hot, or you're doing a higher intensity, or you're doing something different than your race simulations, then, and you mess up your nutrition and get a stomach ache and have to DNF, that, in my opinion, is, you messed up there, right? Let's take practice. Let's use practice for what it is. It's practice. And then let's use the races for what they are, trying to get your maximal performance by not changing anything, right? Um, so I think we can take a step back and we can say, okay, so during exercise, what are the primary fuel sources that your body likes to use? Um, uh, uh, Generally speaking, we have three macronutrients: we have protein, fats, and carbohydrates. For the most part, unless you're in starvation mode, your body does not want to use protein, because it's pretty expensive. I liken it to, like, if you're building a house out of bricks, it's like the bricks, right, that are going in everywhere. Then you have,
And if I
fat.
could,
Oh,
I want to reiterate that because I
yeah.
think a lot of people get that part confused and think that they can utilize that macronutrient as a instant fuel source, and it is 100% not.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of that building block
Mm-hmm.
like ideology. So
Yeah.
I just want to reiterate that, but
Yeah.
keep going, Phil.
Yeah. And if you've, heard people like, "Oh, well, I take, amino acids during a workout, or I do this, that, or the other," it's most likely to try to mitigate any effects of going into a large calorie deficit, like you would during hard, long exercise or something like that. You're not going to use, most likely, there is still a little bit of protein, utilization, but for the most part, your body doesn't want to use that because it's so important for actually building, the structures of your body. But so then you have your fats and your carbohydrates. Your fats are kind of like your low octane fuel. It's when you're sitting here, doing a podcast and you haven't eaten or something like that, you're going to be preferentially oxidizing fats. When you are exercising at low-ish intensity, so really upwards of that zone 2 threshold, like we've talked about, you're going to be utilizing the most amount of fats compared to like anything else. Whereas when you start to get into higher intensity exercise, you have to start breaking down carbohydrate because you need more energy for your cell, and carbohydrates are produce more ATP, which is the energy currency of our cell, faster. So as you exercise harder and harder and harder, you become more reliant on the breakdown of glucose, which is from the blood, or glycogen, which is the stored form of glucose that can be in your muscle. So you have to be aware of what intensities you're exercising at, right? Because if you're exercising at really low intensities, you're going to preferentially be burning fat. Once you start to get into like that zone 2 where we say it's fat max, here's a myth for everybody that we need to bust. Fat max is the place where you're oxidizing the greatest amount of fat, but you're still oxidizing a hell of a lot of carbohydrate at fat max. So when people say fat max, it's not that you're just burning fat. You're burning a high proportion, the highest proportion of fat that your body can burn, but you still have carbohydrate oxidation that's on top of that. That's also supplementing the ATP, the energy generation that you need for that exercise to continue.
And that right there, I mean, I think we've both gotten into conversations with individuals that have gotten that topic wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And they think that you're just burning all fat at that point. And that's not the case. It's kind of that point where we, especially endurance athletes, want to operate the greatest amount of time at, is because that's where you're using dual fuel source and you're lengthening the amount of time your body is going to have substrate on hand.
Mm-hmm.
That's not to talk about what we are going to ingest through the course of exercise or racing in that case. It's more of looking at it as what we have on board with nothing else. That's going to give us the longest amount of duration at the highest of that particular opportunity of output,
Mm-hmm.
to give us that effort and duration.
Yep. So when you're exercising, at those lower intensities, right? You're oxidizing fat, but as you transition over zone 2, you're going to start to oxidize glucose more preferentially, just because you have to generate more energy, and your body simply doesn't have the energy generating potential from fat. It's a slower energy or slower ATP generation. Oh, but what I was going to say is, if you do a lot of exercise, at that zone 2, and this is where, guys like Peter Attia and Inigo San Milan and all these guys talk about zone 2 so much, is because when you're exercising at fat max, your body is going to, and again, this is going to preferentially upregulate enzymes to break down fat. It's going to become better at utilizing that fat. We're going to have this mitochondrial proliferation where, fat is going to be burned more, because the only place in your body that fat can actually be burned is within the mitochondria. So by doing a lot of zone 2 work, you're going to actually become better at burning fat, and then that's going to actually spare that those small stores of glycogen or glucose that's within the blood. So that's one of the reasons why it's recommended to do a lot of work at zone 2, is because it helps you actually become a better fat burning machine, essentially.
And at this, people overlook the adaptation of being more fit through that process, because you still, the more time that you're going to spend within this particular zone, what's going to end up happening, your speeds, your paces, your power outputs are going to start to exponentially go up with the work that you're putting in, and the more fit that you get, which then also allows you to kind of move that ceiling up of your potential at burning at a higher level of output.
Mm-hmm.
with that fat source as your predominant fuel source in that case.
Yep. Yeah, and you know, we were just talking about how all adaptations are kind of on a scale, a gray scale, right? It's not black or white.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a similar sort of situation where, you know, if you're doing zone 2 training, yes, it's been shown that you preferentially upregulate, you know, your mitochondrial volume density, your capillary density, all of these sort of things. But then if you also exercise at, say, you know, kind of like that threshold, you're also, by pushing that up, you're still going to preferentially be burning more fat for the same power output by getting more fit. And one of the big things that actually shuts down fat oxidation is the release of uh, more catecholamines. So your epinephrine, your norepinephrine, those sort of things. Because what they do eventually is they will actually cause vasoconstriction of blood vessels within, or capillary beds within your fat tissue. Your fat tissue isn't stored, for the most part, isn't stored directly in your muscle. There is some fat within your muscle, but you have to get that fat out of your adipose tissue into the bloodstream, into your muscle, in order to actually keep it utilized. So by getting more fit, you're making exercise less of a stress. You release less catecholamine for the same power output, because it's less of a stress, and then you can continue to get fat to the muscle longer.
And one of the things, especially through Endure IQ, that we try to drive this number up and up further and further with fat oxidation. And often what we find is that athletes are recovering faster and there's not as much inflammation due to the fuel source. So really there's not as much byproduct that's being pumped out into the body in that case from utilizing fats as a fuel source as well. So there are some additional benefits to it from just how the body is going to kind of not feel as beat up or carry as much inflammation.
And I wonder if that's, you know, it's probably two pronged, like a two pronged approach, where, you know, if you're trying to focus on actually, you know, exercising at fat max, then you're probably going to have a little bit lower intensity, versus if you're exercising at higher intensities, right, you're going to be utilizing more carbohydrates. And then, you know, from that perspective, it's kind of like, you know, it turns into a zone 3 workout, right? The gray zone, the
Mm-hmm.
bad sort of you know, training zones. So I wonder if, and maybe it's also like a self-limitation thing too. Like if you go into a workout, you know, you've slept overnight, you don't eat in the morning, you go and you do your workout, and you know, then you do your workout. It's supposed to be, you know, fairly easy, right? Zone 2, and you're already limited on carbohydrate. So your body is going, you know, you might have lower liver glycogen, which then could lower your ability for power output. You know, just feel, you know, like those feelings in your legs when your legs are a little heavy. So maybe it's like a self-limiting sort of thing too, where because you're not consuming carbohydrates, you don't feel good or as good as you would, and then it, you know, is like a governor.
This is probably something we could bat back and forth quite a bit because
Yeah.
I also think this is probably one of those topics that is very unique to each individual athlete
Mm-hmm.
because I've been more on that kind of right fuel, right time, or a little bit lower carbohydrate approach. And I mean, not only can I go from a like 5 hour ride to following the next day, still with very low carbohydrate and do a VO2 max or a
Mm.
threshold in that case, and still not necessarily need that carbohydrate source post the 5 hour or pre the hour and 10 minute ride or whatever it might be for the other. So I just think that this might be something where based on kind of your exposure to it, you also might adapt to certain aspects of that too.
Mm-hmm. No, I think anything with diet is highly individualized, right? Kind of like what we were talking like right off the bat. And it's I've always been the type of person where if I'm not consuming like a high amount of carbohydrate, it's like no matter what I do, however easy I go, if I don't refuel like almost immediately or during like the actual workouts, like I'm also a high stress individual, so I think that plays into it. Um, but I've found that like the more carbohydrate I intake, the better I do feel. So and it doesn't really matter, right? It just
Right.
matters like what's best for you and what's best for your body. Because at the end of the day, too, if you're exercising, in zone two at close to zone two, that exercise is going to be much more of a stressor than the type of food, that you are consuming. So you're still going to have mitochondrial proliferation, whether or not you have, carbohydrate on board or you don't. It's just you might have a little bit more, if you're carbohydrate depleted versus if you're, not.
And I think that this probably is the right time to say this is why metabolic testing can be super, super beneficial and
Mm,
important, because not only is it going to tell what your substrate utilization is, it's also going to start to kind of define where in that effort level you are most efficient, or where you're predominantly burning one source or another or equals amounts of sources. So
mm-hmm,
I feel like, you know, with the individualization of this topic, that's one thing. Getting some laboratory testing or getting it done a couple of times is super important, because it's going to start to shape up that picture for you.
mm-hmm,
And in this case, you and I could go back and forth on like our differences. Somebody else might not be as perceptive or have the same education that we have to be in tune enough to make that recognition or that adjustment of what's going to benefit them. So it really, I think that's kind of an important topic to kind of discuss here, just because there are options out there for you to
mm-hmm.
find out what that is for you. And it's metabolic testing in that
Yeah.
case.
Yeah, metabolic testing, and this is something you guys are going to get sick of me talking about this, but I truly think that it's one of if not like the most important things to kind of like calibrate your system, your body, your own individual physiology to whatever training you're going to do. And if you have a great coach like Aaron, who's actually looking at, all of your different, like all of your different workouts, all of your different performances, those sort of things, then, you know, his input is going to help you kind of figure out where your different zones are and stuff. But if you don't have a great coach, then doing metabolic testing will at least give you an idea, an estimation of where, say different zones are occurring, where you switch from fat oxidation to carbohydrate oxidation. And it's again, it's not as cut and dry as we would really want it to be, because most of the time when you go into say metabolic testing or something like that, it's like, okay, well, you can eat 3 hours beforehand but then make sure you're digesting it. Or if you go in fasted, that's all of these different sort of preparations are going to actually result in slightly different outcomes in terms of what your substrate utilization are. So something I've been thinking about lately, and this probably isn't possible for many people, but I was like, it would be great to do a completely fasted, like substrate utilization test, step test, whatever you want to do. Then come back at the end of the week after you've, kind of like carbo loaded, done all that sort of stuff, do and recovered fully, and then go into the like do exactly what you would do on race day, like in the morning, and then see what your substrate utilization is, and then have one in the middle of a hard training block to see what your substrate utilization is. So do, like multiple, because you're going to have different substrate utilization based on how fatigued you are, based on how many carbohydrates you ate, based on how much fat you ate, based on how much calories you're intaking, all of this sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, at least getting a test where you're doing something that's kind of simulating, like, either like a training day or something like that, is going to guide you in a better direction than just being like, oh yeah, like I heard on this podcast, that I should be oxidizing 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So I'm going to intake 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour, right?
Well, and I think you just gave a business plan to somebody out there that has some laboratories of, hey, I'm going to start bulking these three together and
Well,
have that as their format. But
and yeah, and that's exactly what I've been thinking about doing. So if you're out in the Oregon area, hit me up and we can start doing this sort of testing.
and I typically how we direct our athletes is even if they're a lower carb athlete or moderate carb athlete or a high carb athlete, we have them come back into kind of normal what they would do for preload race wise
Mhm.
because the numbers show a little bit more like realistic real world number output at that point, and we try to have them go in fasted for the testing because it's repeatable.
Yeah,
Now
yeah.
your point there is extremely important where it's also probably good to know what you're going to do on race day. So if you're often going into workouts fasted, yeah, go into that test fasted as well because that's going to give you a relatable response to what you're doing most of the time. But again, it's still very, very important to get what you would probably do on race day. And if you're going to be consuming this particular breakfast, you want to start to recognize how your body starts to utilize substrate going into that event because it's truly going to be very pivotal of how you are going to perform and how long you're going to be able to sustain that before running out of one onboard energy and then two what you're able to absorb per hour in that case.
Hmm.
So like if you're an athlete that's burning 200 grams of carbohydrates per hour in a there is a very low ceiling that I mean, if you start to do the math of a full distance Ironman, I'm only maybe able to absorb 90 to 120 grams possibly
Hmm.
per hour. There's a negative of 80 to 110 grams there that you're going to be hitting every hour that you're on the course, and you're going to start to look and say, "Oh crap, that only gets me to the front half of the run."
Right.
And crap, I still got 26 miles.
Yeah.
So I feel like having that knowledge also allows you to put together a quality race plan and nutrition plan
Hmm.
because ideally you're going to want to find where you can go the longest, kind of what we talked about earlier, at the highest power and still have that energy to cross that finish line or get close to that finish line so you can crawl, not
Yeah,
crawl the
crawl your
entire run.
yeah, no, exactly. I think, and you can put numbers to this, so it's not just a magical guessing game. Oh, I might run out of carbohydrates. There's tons of studies out there that's like, in a male who has this much, muscle mass, this is how much carbohydrate that can be stored in the muscle. And and it's not very much. I think it's like, yeah, I can't even remember, but it's not very much. And it's one of those things where when you start doing the math with it and you start to be like, oh well, say if you had 10% body fat or something like that, which is still pretty lean, and you're 150 pounds, then that's 15 pounds of fat. 15 pounds of fat on your body is 3,700 calories, I believe, per pound of body fat. That, I can't remember exactly what it was, but I calculated it out. Like that's enough to run like 20 or 30 marathons.
I think the often one that I say is it's enough to go from Maine to Georgia if you're familiar with the states. It's like a really like when you start to think about it, you're like, holy cow, that's a really long way.
Yeah. Yeah, like so even lean individuals have a lot of energy stored on their body, and this is where the idea, I think, of more fat adapted athlete started to come into play, right? Is because if you can maximize the amount of fat oxidation or fat that you can actually utilize, then you can start to kind of tap into that almost unlimited energy source. The problem is again, it's a little bit slower of an energy source, so you're going to lose a little bit of performance. But if you're doing things like an Ironman, things like an ultra marathon, other things like that that are really long, then it doesn't really matter in terms of like, because you're going to be exercising really close, maybe a little bit under that fat max for extended periods of time, right? Um, so from the perspective of, it makes sense during those longer races to actually be able to utilize, more fat. And, maybe from that perspective, I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage just because I am the type of person I think that, utilizes more carbohydrate. And that might just be who I am. But I also think I do a bad job of actually eating enough calories to then replenish myself on a day-to-day basis. Because if, say you do a 5-hour workout like you're talking about, but then you just like don't eat anything, that's certainly going to lead to, potential challenges, the next day, because you're just not recovering because you don't have enough fuel on board. And again, being that high stress individual who, when I do get stressed, I have a tendency not to eat. It just makes it really hard to actually consume enough calories in general. And calories are what's going to, well, first of all, calories in terms of you need enough protein because you need to be able to build the foundation of your house. Then you need to have enough fat and or carbohydrate in order to then fuel that rebuilding process and that recovery process. So if you're constantly eating in a calorie deficit, this is where you start to see people who are just like, oh, I'm just not getting better. I'm plateauing. I'm like, I get sick often. Um, all that sort of stuff. So
Well, you end up having soft tissue issues. You have bone issues. I mean, hormonal imbalances at that point,
yeah.
and that's where metabolic syndromes start to come in and really play havoc on the rest of your life, and then they end up translating even worse into your overall workouts. So it's always important to pay attention to that aspect, no matter what type of athlete you follow, like whatever principles you fuel with.
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter of taking in enough calories in that case. And as you talked about, especially on the 5 hour ride that I used as an example, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm still not taking in some fat during that ride. And also 100%, the first thing that is happening about if I don't have a run off the bike right afterwards, the first thing that I'm doing or if I do have a run off the bike, the first thing that I'm doing is getting calories within the system right away. Typically, in my sense, I am taking a liquid protein and carbohydrate source after that ride.
Mm-hmm.
Then, about an hour later, I'm actually having a meal following that. So, therefore, I'm kind of maximizing the amount I can absorb
Right.
from all nutrients. The last thing that you want to do, especially in that case, is I get done with that big session and then I just eat like 2,400 calories or whatever it might be. I'm most likely not going to be able to absorb a big portion of that. So it's almost, you start over the next couple of hours, almost do like a drip effect where
Mm-hmm.
you're giving the system smaller amounts, letting that be absorbed and broken down, and then just continue that over the next 4 to 5 hours. It's about the same amount of food in the grand scheme of things, but you're giving it to the system in a much more efficient way that it can handle
Mm-hmm.
and absorb and break it down.
Yeah. I think, especially from like a satiety standpoint too, right? If you went and you just tried to eat, like, a big meal right after your workout, say that's 1,000 to 1,500 calories or something like that, you're going to be fuller longer. So you're not actually able to then replace more of those calories that you should be taking in. Because if you're doing a lot of exercise, especially as a, you know, almost 6 foot tall, 100 and for me, 170-pound male, like that, you could be burning upwards of 3,000 plus calories a day, which
Yeah.
then eating becomes a job essentially, right? Um, and it's one of those things. It's more important to get the calories in. And actually, there was a study I saw that was like they had I can't remember exactly what the population was, but they had a group of individuals, and they would exercise them, and they either gave them, like healthy food replacement or fast food replacement. And it was like pretty high, like high level individuals who are, burning a lot of calories and stuff. But from the perspective of like performance output and other things like that, I'm not saying I don't do this, people, because it's probably not best for your overall longevity and health. But they were finding that performance was exactly the same between the two groups. So at the end of the day, that what I'm trying to say is calories should be kind of like calories and protein should be your first, sort of thing. And then you can start to tweak and figure out, am I more fat? Like, do I do better with fat? Do I do better with carbohydrates? Do I do better with a combination of the two? Um, so Aaron, actually, I would, if you're willing to share, I would love to, get an idea of like, so if you're doing, your Ironman, half Ironman training and stuff like that, what does a typical day of, like eating and training sort of look like? Say you're doing like a long bike ride or something like that. You wake up on a Saturday, like what's the protocol?
So typically, I do go into the ride fasted, but I take ketones in about a
Mm-hmm.
half an hour before the ride.
How many
That's
grams of ketones are you taking in?
um, it's a half a bottle of tactical from Delta G. I can't say off the top of my head of what that exact number is. It's just like a fluid ounce, and I just break it up and take it 30 minutes before. I should
Okay.
probably know that number, but that's and I just know that I take a half of a bottle
Yeah,
of
yeah.
tactical right before. And traditionally, it really it depends on what phase or block I'm in within that particular training. Now, if we're in the general base, I'm really just consuming water and electrolytes through that ride up until maybe like there are times based on what the work is later that day or later in the week where if I get above 4 hours, then I might start to add just a different fuel source just so I'm not creating that big negative caloric deficit.
Mm-hmm.
But traditionally, I would anything up to 4 hours, I'm not consuming anything outside of water or electrolytes. Now you flip that into more of a specific or competition style bike ride, then I'm not like I get 30 to 45 minutes into that workout before I start putting the system with carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
If it's traditionally for me, if we're looking at a half distance Ironman, I do it right around more that 30-minute. If it's a full distance, I'm looking at 45 minutes to an hour just based on what I'm expected to kind of be in the water. And I'm not an individual that sits down and has like I've talked to athletes for their morning breakfast who have like 2 cups of applesauce or like I'm not an individual that's taking in really much carbohydrate in the morning of a race because I just like to keep things extremely steady
Mm-hmm.
from blood glucose levels. So I'm not taking in if there is a carbohydrate, it's more of a resistive carbohydrate at that point. But in those training sessions, I'm trying to simulate it very, very similarly to how it's going to come up into the race. So
Mm-hmm.
when I do get on the bike, I've already had a swim, or I've already had a half Ironman swim at 1.2 miles, or I've had a full Ironman swim at 2.4. That's kind of be right around that half an hour, depending on the water conditions around 26 minutes to an hour and 10 minutes in that
Mm-hmm.
case. So I start to kind of then put the system into a consuming carbohydrate. And traditionally, I am more of a highly branched cyclic dextrin. I do not like racing on sugar. I like to I feel like highly branched cyclic dextrin right now is showing to be a very, very highly absorbable carbohydrate. It has quick gastric emptying, so therefore it's moving through the system and not kind of stalling within the stomach, or as you talked about earlier, moving into the large intestines to cause some of those GI issues.
Mm-hmm.
So I start that kind of right in that more specific ride, or that competition style. So it's actually like a race simulation. But I probably should throw the caveat that I typically only do that if the ride is over 2.5 hours. If the ride is
Wow.
under 2.5 hours, I still don't fuel. I
Yeah.
am only watering electrolytes in that case, because I've found that I can put out race pace efforts for about that 2 hours on the bike and not lose any, like, at least my power targets. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not missing those power targets within those rides. So where that starts to adjust is, let's say that I do have a 2 hour specific bike and it's a little bit of a longer run off the bike, then I will throw in a little bit of carbohydrate probably at that hour and a half to 2 hour mark, just to make sure that the run finishes off strong.
Mm-hmm.
But hopefully, I know that was long winded of what you asked, but that's kind of it. It really depends on what block or phase that I'm in, to what and how I'm going to nourish my body. And the one thing that's consistent is, if it's aerobic, I am trying to just go off of water and electrolytes.
Mm-hmm.
If it is more of race pace over that 2.5 hours, that's when I start to throw in, and often it's a highly branched cyclic dextrin for me.
Okay. And in terms of the amount of carbohydrate, so that highly branched cyclic dextrin, what's your target for that per hour?
50 to 60 grams.
Okay. So yeah, and I mean, like, again, this is the crazy, this is how different it can be, right? There's some people like yourself who you're like, and I imagine, since you've been training and doing, this stuff for so long at this point, you've probably had, if there are transitions from type 2 to type 1 fibers, you're probably getting closer to a lot more type 1 fibers, which are more highly reliant on fat and other things like that. So, there could be a fiber type, sort of deal to, what you need to be intaking. Um, and
And I would agree with that. I mean, especially in my baseball career, I have to believe, I never had it tested, but I'm assuming I was much more type 2 dominant, because most of my movements were explosive. Baseball's
mhm,
not any, it's nowhere close to an endurance activity. It's
right.
something where you explode and then you stop. So I would agree with you on that. But the funny thing about it is, Phil, I can still throw out probably 100, and, like, for my 30-second repeats or 40-second repeat VO2 max efforts, I can still, with no carbohydrate, I still put out probably 122 to 135% of my
Mm.
FTP in those cases. So I don't know if that necessarily pivots on that.
Yeah. And so back, oh man, it was a few years ago, like 5 or 6 years ago, where there was a study that was released that basically showed these individuals who went on like a pretty strict ketogenic diet, um, eventually got to, like 1.2 grams of carbohydrate, per minute or something like that being oxidized, which is really high in terms of,
Mm-hmm.
or fat oxidation, excuse me.
That yeah.
Fat oxidation, yeah, per minute, but it took them like 9 months to a year to get there. So, so now we have a bunch of studies that have like followed up, like tried to follow up with that, but most of the time it's short term. So, so I think there's still a disconnect between the amount of time it takes you to build up those adaptations to become more fat adapted per se. And, but you're doing, like, you pretty much do exactly like, what like a Zach Bitter would do, right? Where, so for those of you who don't know, Zach Bitter, I don't know if he still holds the record, but had like the American record for like ultra distance racing for a while. It might be
I
Jim
think he still
Walmsley.
has the 100-mile treadmill world
Okay.
record.
Yeah. But he got really famous, and because he was kind of doing this more like fat adapted athlete sort of thing. But what I think people do miss is that when he was getting into the race specific efforts, exactly like what you were saying, Aaron, is he was actually taking in carbohydrates, and he was taking in carbohydrates and proteins following those workouts. Um, so I think if you are somebody who is interested in giving this a try, it's not all just ketogenic diet all the time with like 5 grams of carbohydrates and stuff. It's, for the most part, you're doing your exercise in a fasted state, but then, you're in the more specific workouts, you're actually taking in carbohydrates and you're trying to maximize that carbohydrate intake, because during those higher intensity bouts, you are going to be burning more carbohydrates. And it's again, it's that ticking time bomb, right? You run out of glycogen, and that's where you see people hit the wall, right? During or bonk during a marathon and stuff. Okay. So that's really good information though, because obviously it should depend on what you're doing, what your activity levels are. If you're just going out for an easy workout or something like that, it makes sense that you shouldn't need to be intaking carbohydrates if you don't, if you don't want to and you're adapted to it.
Well, and the other thing to that, Phil, is that most of these endurance products, I mean, most of them are not very healthy. I mean, they're using either simple sugars or maltodextrin or other things that your system doesn't necessarily or shouldn't be often exposed to.
Mm-hmm.
And I've kind of transitioned. I'm kind of in the 90 athlete range of taking individuals from super high carbohydrate to a more right fuel, right time approach. And it is what we would consider more either a lower carb or moderate carb. I just want to make sure that people, it's not a ketogenic diet in this
Right.
case. Sometimes when people hear lower carbohydrate, that's automatically where they jump, but that is
Yeah.
not the case at all. Um, and often what they tell me is like, I'm not leaving the house like weighted down by all these products that are
Yeah.
in my bag or my back pockets on my cycling jerseys. So it's something that kind of frees you up from having
Mm-hmm.
that crutch of, well, I'm going out on a 2 hour ride and I need this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you probably don't, and you are going to leave the house a little bit lighter.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I was actually thinking that exact thing. I was like, man, it must be nice just to be able to fill up your water, and if you have like, your electrolyte tablets or a powder or something like that, just dump it into your water too, and then away you go. Like, for example, I did like a step test this morning, and I was like, I think I need, a little bit more like fuel and carbohydrates today. So I made like, two of like the Morton bottles, and I had those, and I had to set them up next to my thing, and I had to get them all prepped and ready to go. And it's just like one extra thing that you have to do. It's the same thing with, like I love technology, but the setup of the technology and like getting it working and like all of that can sometimes again be a hindrance to the joy of actually going and doing your training and all of that. So I was certainly thinking about that. Okay, I guess my next follow up question though is, so if you're intaking just water and electrolytes, what's your refueling strategy afterwards? Like, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but 5 hours of exercise is a lot of calorie burn, and you need a lot of calories in order to like sustain this sort of stuff, right? You don't want to get into a calorie deficit for too long, or else you'll have hormonal issues. You're essentially, going to be malnourished, and you're going to be pulling bricks out of your foundation that you're laying, and
Right.
then it's just a matter of time before things start to crumble.
Well, and also I have a wife that relies and three dogs that rely on me to have energy after that workout
Yeah.
to hold the fort down too. So I I really, one of the initial things that I do when I get done with that workout, like I said, whether it's just a bike or a brick where I'm getting off the bike doing a little bit of a run, it's I use S Fuels Revival in that case. It's just a chocolate protein drink with beta hydroxybutyrate, has a fairly high amount of sodium, very low amount of carbohydrates and no sugar in that particular brand of protein. I mix it with a frozen stick of spirulina, and I use a flaxseed milk, and a scoop of peanut butter. So about a tablespoon of peanut butter in that. That's right after I get off out of that workout. That is right away. So it's typically within about 20 minutes to 15, probably closer to the 10 minutes after that workout that I'm getting that liquid protein in. Um, Following that, depending on a Saturday, if you're putting in 5 hours, you're now into the afternoon. But I still probably follow that up with in about an hour after that. I'm either a 6 ounce fillet of fish or, and I guess I should say not fillet o fish, but so like a cut of salmon in that
Yeah,
case,
yeah, yeah.
not a sandwich from McDonald's, but either that or I will come back with about 4, 5 eggs cooked whatever way that I'm feeling.
Hmm.
Um, and typically like something like a salad or some type of vegetable at that point. I still not kind of following up with like a starchy or a starchy carbohydrate at that point. It's more just a vegetable carbohydrate at that point. Um, that is roughly about that hour point after that workout. Then, most likely I'm getting into a portion of the day and I will have some type of, whether it be a nut snack or sometimes I could have like the night before or the night before's dinner's leftovers for another snack about 2.5 hours after that 1 hour post workout meal. So
Hmm.
over the course of probably 3.5 hours to 4 hours, I've already consumed a shake, an actual recovery meal in that case, and then another snack that is fairly robust with protein, fat, and typically still not a whole lot of carbohydrates because my following day's workout is going to typically be an aerobic endurance run.
Hmm.
And I still want to keep muscle glycogen fairly low in that case so I can continue to go and push that number of fat oxidation in that next workout.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's a, it's, it's one of those things that I've like, I go back and forth because, I always, I think in terms of, I think in performance and health are different, right? If you're really pushing performance, then I think you can get away with, like those like simple carbohydrates, other things like that for a little bit longer, because your furnace is burning so hot that your body is just like, okay, I just need, fuel and
Something.
energy and stuff like that. The problem is that, when that becomes, kind of a habit, and that sort of stuff is hyper palatable, right? It makes you want to eat more of that sort of stuff. So then once you stop competing and stop exercising, like 4 hours a day plus, then it starts to be a hindrance, because then you start to potentially get uh you're not eating in a calorie deficit anymore. You're in a calorie surplus. You start storing more fat. You start having constantly high levels of muscle glycogen, those sort of things. And all of that is going to act, negatively towards your, glucose sensitivity, which eventually could lead to things like type 2 diabetes and other things like that. Um, so yeah, it's really interesting because, the way that you approach a lot of this sort of stuff is what I was like looking. Ben Greenfield actually was one of the first people who was kind of like doing this a long time ago, and then I think because he went so low carbohydrate for so long, he was like it wrecked me, like it wrecked his
Yeah.
endocrine system. It was like it was really really bad. um so I was like I kind of got on that train, super low carbohydrate. And this is don't do super low carbohydrate. Like it's not the ketogenic diet, at least from a pharmacological perspective, was designed for people who have seizures. And when you have really really low carbohydrate, it actually reduces in some people the risk of seizures and all of that. However, you need carbohydrate. You still need carbohydrate to to fuel things. um and it can result in negatives to hormone balance, other things like that. So um it, it's not a low a super low carbohydrate diet, like a ketogenic diet or anything like that. It's being mindful of the types of carbohydrates that you're actually intaking, more along the lines of like a starchy vegetable or other, fruits and vegetables, stuff like that. But at least, correct me if I'm wrong, but at least from your perspective, Aaron, it's getting most of your fuels from, you know, from fats, right? That's where the eggs come in. That's where the peanut butters come in. That's where the nuts and stuff come in too. So
Well, and I mean that and a hefty amount of protein because I
yes, yes, yes,
am
yes.
I'm treating my body like a little bit of an amusement park from that standpoint, and it needs to get repaired and rebuilt. So
Right.
there's definitely a hefty amount of protein in that case, and I think the biggest importance with anybody that kind of looks at this is that individuals that are moving from, let's just say individuals that are looking to move from one diet to another, and that diet being higher carbohydrate and then moving to a low carbohydrate or more moderate carbohydrate, often people aren't like replacing that caloric amount that they're taking in from carbohydrates with something else.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it becomes a super super slippery slope is when you remove, let's say that you're taking in 200 grams of carbohydrates, or let's say that you're taking in 500 grams of carbohydrates, and then you remove that down to 200, which I
Mm-hmm.
think 200 is all that most people really do need on a day-to-day basis. um, when you're removing 300 grams of, you're talking about at that point 12, like if I'm doing the math, we're 1,200 calories
Mm-hmm.
from just carbohydrates in that case. If you don't replenish that with fats or proteins, what are you doing? You're creating that
Caloric
calorie, like
deficit.
you're creating a deficit in that case.
Yes.
And I think that that's where often people get it wrong, is that they don't replace one with the other, and next thing you know, they're a couple of weeks in and saying, well, I'm only taking in 1,500 calories when I was taking in close to 3,000. That's where things really have that
Mm-hmm.
opportunity to get wrecked. And it's, I, a lot of it is just what we've learned since we were kids, is that fat can be, it's been presented to us like it's this awful thing, but there are bad fats out there, but there's really good fats that help skin complexion health, repair,
Mm-hmm.
rebuild. And so it's just replacing the right things with what you're removing in that case. But again, it's not a matter of what's right or wrong, it's what fits for you. But you're kind of what you talked about earlier about, if you are used to giving yourself this and then you remove and you're in the middle of exercise and you remove the exercise but continue to provide your nutrition is not changing it. I mean, there's a lot of research that's coming out that's talking about endurance athletes that are type 1 or are type 2 diabetics or pre-diabetic, and in that case it's they haven't adjusted or altered their diet
Mm-hmm.
with coming to the end of their competitive like career in that case.
Yep.
And that's where it gets very very complicated, is it doesn't take very long for your body, if you're flushing it with processed carbohydrates or inefficient carbohydrates, that your body's going to start to kind of take a tailspin a little bit in that
Yeah.
case.
So my research during my PhD kind of focused on diet induced obesity, and then how diet induced obesity and metabolic disease, and then how exercise can reverse some of those effects. And the really interesting thing is, so there's a couple of things that I want to focus on here. The first one is that both a high fat and a high carbohydrate diet can both lead to insulin resistance. The biggest thing that affects that is if you're in a caloric surplus or a caloric deficit. If you're in a surplus, you can essentially go uh, acutely diabetic, or like acutely insulin resistant, in a matter of a few days to weeks. Like it doesn't matter when you are switching diets. I think it's important to track what you're eating. So what you're eating beforehand and then what you're eating afterwards, and get an idea of, like, first it's always caloric balance, right? That's the biggest thing. And then from there, then you can start to say, oh, well, I realized I was eating a lot of, like these processed foods and stuff like that. So I want to switch, to say, like, to be more of a fat adapted athlete. So then it becomes a game of, like, what can you replace with what things? Because that gets hard, right? Anytime
Mhm.
you switch up your lifestyle, your diet, those sort of things, it just gets hard to really know. And then the third thing I want people to think about is, when we say a high carbohydrate diet, it's high carbohydrate, moderate to low fat, and moderate and adequate protein. For most people, if you're just eating a normal Western diet, which is like, the Western American diet, those carbohydrate, or the macronutrient breakdown is like 40% carbohydrates, 30% fat, 30% protein. That is not, in any extent, in any realm, a high carbohydrate or a high fat diet. That is middle of the road. And that is actually what we feed our mice to get the worst outcomes. So when you do mouse studies, now you'll start to see people, like, give them a Western diet, which is 40, 30, 30. And these mice get wrecked so fast because they eat so much of this food. It weirdly enough, it smells like stale McDonald's. So, like, you're like, okay, like, I get why they would want to eat it, right? Like, it's disgusting, but, like, I get it. And so that's also an evaluation of, am I really eating either high carbohydrate or a little bit lower carbohydrate, or am I just kind of in the middle eating a Western diet, and then then I'm kind of just eating too much all the time? Because I think
Yeah.
that's, like, there's big rocks, right? The big rocks are, calorie deficit or caloric balance, especially if we're talking about performance. You want to maintain caloric balance. Then you can start to look at, you have to maintain adequate protein. And adequate protein for an endurance athlete can be anywhere from like 1.5 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, not pound. It would be about one gram per pound of body weight, maybe a little bit more, especially if you're really, really getting into it, like doing, 4 or 5 hours a day of work. Because again, that's kind of your repair, uh, or not kind of, it is your repair macronutrient. And then after you've hit your calorie and your protein targets, then you can start to play with, like, the macronutrient distribution of carbohydrates and fats to see which one works best for you.
And I think the most important thing that you talked about is tracking.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you put it on paper, then that's often a lot of people's credibility coach right there is, oh, I did this. And I often, working with a lot of athletes and even non-athletes, especially here in America, it's their lack of understanding of what's in what they're consuming as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like when you start to track, you have those numbers, those macros that we've talked about most of this episode, they're right in front of you. You
Mm-hmm.
start to see what the breakdown of those foods are, and then you maybe say, I don't think that this is something that's probably good at this point because it's throwing everything else off.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that from just a knowledge base allows you to make smarter choices if you're keeping track of what you're consuming. I think the biggest complication that we have from a tracking standpoint right now is it sadly is so much easier to track processed foods or
Mm-hmm.
packaged foods because they have that stinking barcode. People can get their MyFitnessPal or Senza app or whatever they're using,
Mm-hmm.
scan that barcode and it brings it in. But oh, if I just cooked a fresh like thing of fish, I had let's just say a cup or half a cup of rice with it, like all these different things. You're having to like kind of break it down and add it up as you go,
Yeah.
or give a rough estimate for non prepackaged foods, but
And then people estimating those things way off.
way off.
They're
Yeah.
like, okay, so 4 ounces of like meat is like the palm of your hand. But obviously, me being I'm 6 foot, the palm of my hand is going to be a lot different than someone who's 5 foot, right? It gets complicated. And even so, there's numbers, or there's people who have said that even the numbers on the labels for processed foods can be plus or minus 10 or 20%. So they can be off. So
Right.
but at the end of the day, if you track a little bit, you start to become aware, and it's becoming aware that's important. You become aware
Absolutely.
of what's in your food, and then from there you can start to make more educated decisions on what you're eating. And I don't think we meant for this to become like a health sort of thing. But at the end of the day, right, one of the reasons why we exercise is to stay healthy and maintain, health and longevity throughout our lifespan. So it's important to know what you're putting into your body, and it's important to know that, you can't you can't just, eat eat, because eventually that could have, long-term health ramifications for you.
Absolutely. And I I feel like what you consume for long periods of time also shapes up how you're going to kind of utilize things in the future. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're consuming massive amounts of this or that, like processed foods, it's most likely going to affect the way that your energy balance is 5 and 10 years unless you make an adjustment. So
Mm-hmm.
it has a way of kind of dictating what your future might look like within like substrate utilization too.
Yeah, definitely. I think we'll stop it there. I think this is a really good discussion on substrate utilization, everything from what they are to, how you approach it, how I've approached it in the past. And if people have any questions about, substrate utilization, Aaron's approach, my approach, anything like that, you can find me at Critical Oxygen or Critical O2 on Instagram. You can find Aaron at Try a Geyser. If you just have questions and you just want to direct both to me and Aaron, to my Instagram, that's also totally fine. If you're on YouTube, comment down below, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.